Hello, friends, and welcome to Books on Faith and Meaning. My name is Katie Grosh, and I'm the Faith Initiative Coordinator at Grace Farms Foundation. And I'm so delighted to welcome you to this time of conversation with Christian Wiman about the anthology Home, 100 Poems. Our Books on Faith and Meaning series is oriented around the Faith Initiative's core question. And that question is, what is the shape of flourishing life? Each month, we engage with different texts, from ancient classics to newly published books, from a variety of religious and philosophical traditions. And we can ask and encounter these important questions of meaning and purpose, not alone, but in the company of others. While we know that reading is just a portion of our journey, we believe that these texts can connect us to people, histories, and ideas that can contribute substantially to our quest for flourishing life, both for our own lives and for the lives of others in our communities. Before we begin today, just a few quick announcements. A quick reminder that this webinar is being recorded and will be available afterwards on our website at gracefarms.org/faith. If you've registered for this event today, I'll send you an email letting you know when the recording is ready, along with some reflection questions and information about upcoming events. And for those of you who are with us live today, feel free to ask your questions now. Feel free to use that Q&A function at the bottom of your screen at any point today during the discussion. So you don't need to wait to the end of the hour. Type in your questions into the Q&A box as they occur to you, and Matt will weave them in throughout the conversation. And with that, I'd like to introduce Matthew Krausman, Faith Initiative Director at Grace Farms Foundation.
Thanks, Katie. Check a newspaper, turn on the news, it's easy to see. We live at the nexus of a number of overlapping crises. The climate crisis, growing economic disparities, forced migration, white supremacy. These crises are interconnected and inseparable. So this much is clear every day as we live in our world. What we may not as quickly appreciate is the extent to which each of these crises are, in a certain sense, crises of home. For most of us, home means our domestic home, the people in our household, friends, roommates, a partner, a spouse, parents, children, and the place where that household resides. But our spheres of home can be and are often more expansive. The Greek language of oikos, from which both economics and ecology are derived, speaks to broader scales of overlapping and interdependent homes and suggests that the changing planet, growing gaps between rich and poor, and the insidious effects of white supremacy are actually results, in a certain sense, of failures to be at home with one another and within the natural world. And this broader sense of home would include the built environment, the architectural settings we construct, and communities of faith, the people who accompany us on our journeys. We could go on. While home at any of these scales can be a source of profound longing, and also, if we find our way to it, profound comfort, for just this reason, home can also be a site of pain and suffering and, as we know, even in domestic violence. In short, if we want to consider the shape of flourishing life at whatever scale, we do well to consider what it means to be at home, what it takes to be at home, what it would be to welcome one another into our homes. But where to begin? How on earth could we hold all these diverse senses of home together at once? When we're trying to think these kinds of thoughts, ask ourselves these kinds of questions, poetry often is the way forward. And Christian Wiman's edited volume of poetry, Home, 100 Poems, speaks into these many different senses of home and many more beside. Christian Wiman is professor of the practice of religion and literature at Yale Divinity School. He is the author, editor, or translator of 10 books, including Hammer is the Prayer, My Bright Abyss, and Stolen Air. From 2003 until 2013, he was the editor of Poetry Magazine, the premier magazine for poetry in the English-speaking world. I could go on. Suffice to say, we are so honored, Chris, to have you join us today. Chris, welcome.
Thanks for having me. Hi, Matt. How are you doing?
It's good to see you. I'm doing well. I mean, to start off with, why home, and why home now?
I started this before the pandemic, so I can't really blame it on that when the questions became more urgent in a lot of ways. But I didn't start it, but the contract was signed beforehand. But home is an idea that has obsessed me my whole life. I grew up in West Texas, in a small town in Snyder, Texas, where the culture and lives were very circumscribed and coherent, and left that when I was 17 and sort of never looked back. And then for a number of years lived all over the place, all over the world, really. And the question of home became urgent to me, mostly as a writer, what it means for your work to leave the place where you're from. Reynolds Price used to say it was the biggest disaster that could ever happen to a writer was to leave the place that you're from. But that would leave out a lot of writers who found it necessary to leave. And I certainly couldn't spend my life there in Snyder, Texas. I once wrote an essay when I was young called On Being Nowhere, which was an attempt to wrestle with this fact that I'd come out of such a stable place and then become such an itinerant person. And it was, in a way, a sort of celebration of that itinerancy, because everyone I knew was living a life like mine. And it was like, what can home mean in this instance? Simone Weil says we must take the feeling of being at home into exile. We must be rooted in the absence of a place. And I remember first coming across that and thinking, oh, wow, that articulates it exactly. How do you take that feeling of home into exile? Or how do you find yourself rooted in absence, which is a spiritual notion? And then I agree with you that the notion does touch on all of these crises that we're dealing with as a culture, that you can find the question of home at the center of lots of them. Who gets to be at home in this country? What does it mean to be driven away from your home because of change? All of these questions acquire more urgency. And so that was the reason. I had done an anthology on joy, and I really loved the experience of focusing on one particular thing with poetry and coming to terms with it. And home seemed a natural outgrowth of that. And I was having conversations with Miroslav Volf. You and Miroslav have now published these books on home. And so Miroslav and I take walks together, and I don't remember this, but I mean, we must have been talking about it. So it was in the air.
Yeah, sure. You note at the end of the introductory essay that most of the work of this book was taken up during the pandemic, and you just said now that home sort of took up a certain sort of new sort of urgency. How do you think the pandemic sort of shaped this collection, or even more broadly for all of us? In what ways has the question of home been sharpened, do you think, for us, or even maybe distorted unhelpfully during the pandemic?
Well, one way was simply practical, because I didn't have access to libraries, so I couldn't just pull all these books off the shelf like I used to, and so it is circumscribed in that way. It's my shelves and the internet and my friends, what they led me to. I didn't find that too much of a hindrance, actually. I was able to come across things from all over the place. But a deeper question is, I mean, it's one thing to ask yourself when you're floating around, what does home mean intellectually and abstractly, and how do I live up to some notion of home if I don't really have one? It's quite another when you're suddenly confined to a home, and and just this is what you have to live with. And like a lot of people, my family found it both a blessing and a curse. I mean, there are all kinds of things that led us to do as a family, which had to do with home, with identifying and securing and living into this one place. And then there were all kinds of frictions that emerged from all of us identifying and securing and living in this one place. so it was a mixed bag. And I think people tend to sentimentalize the notion of home. And that's one thing I was definitely not going to do in this book, was I was looking for a range of things that showed the complexity of the idea.
Yeah. That is clear. And I think one of the places that where sentimentality, from which sentimentality might spring, would be a sort of nostalgia about home. And memory, though, of course, then is a theme like you have to take up. We have to think about when we think about home. I wonder if you might read for us a poem that's actually not technically, I suppose, part of the collection, but it's in your introductory essay, Nostos by Louise Glick. Yeah.
This is poem by Louise Glick. She teaches at Yale and she won the Nobel Prize recently. This is a well-known poem called Nostos, which means home, literally, but particularly a hero's home, like a homecoming. So it has kind of grand, exalted notions. There was an apple tree in the yard. This would have been 40 years ago. Behind, only meadows, drifts of crocus in the damp grass. I stood at that window, late April, spring flowers in the neighbor's yard. How many times, really, did the tree flower on my birthday, the exact day, not before, not after? Substitution of the immutable for the shifting, the evolving. Substitution of the image for relentless earth. What do I know of this place? The role of the tree for decades taken by a bonsai, voices rising from the tennis courts, fields, smell of the tall grass, new cut, as one expects of a lyric poet. We look at the world once, in childhood. The rest is memory.
Those last two lines are so striking. It's not to reduce poetry to to theses, but that's a strong thesis.
Yeah.
We look at the world but once in childhood, and all the rest we're just remembering. I mean, I suppose I guess what it made me think of first on reading it was that made me think of sort of philosophy of language almost, right? That every time we use a word, we are remembering some sort of previous time. I think about sort of like how language acquisition works. It's like a pattern recognition that, this word is appropriate to this sort of moment. Is this that sort of moment again? Perhaps this word is appropriate again. My mother wrote on language acquisition, and a toddler Matt shows up in the dissertation. When the first time I saw the ocean, apparently, I looked at it and I looked at my mother. I said, "Mama, look, juice." Like so much juice. So I don't know. So in that sense, I suppose I have some sympathy for this sort of way of thinking. Are you drawn to this idea, or you want to resist it? Like how much of home is purely memory? How much of life is just memory?
Well, a good part of it, but not all of it. It's like language. There's a line by Robert Haas where he talks about each word is some tragic falling away from a world of undivided light. So that every time when you speak, you're somehow losing that world of undivided light where things were whole and possibly home. It could be a home. But I think it's all an intermingling of experience and memory. It's not one where you have an experience and then one where you have a memory. I think it's both. I mean, I wonder if we even look at the world once, that it's all this process. And I think that's what she's getting at when she talks about our instinct to make a kind of icon or a moment out of the flux of experience. And so clearly in her family, this tree flowered on her birthday, and maybe it was a part of family lore. It did it every year, but she's like, well, how true can that be?
Yeah.
Probably not that true.
Yeah.
And so we make these moments into things that we can fix on.
Yeah.
When in fact it's all and always flux.
Huh.
And our memory tempts us to pick these moments out. There's an elegiac quality to this, and it comes out of William Wordsworth, the 19th century poet, late 18th or the 19th century poet, who wrote a lot about childhood and found the meaning of his life there. Mostly these moments of joy. But for Wordsworth, can you hear me? Is my internet okay?
Yeah, we got you.
Yeah. Okay. For Wordsworth, these moments were mingled with terror. It was both the joy of the experience and the terror of falling away from it, the joy of the the rapture of the experience, and also the kind of terror that rapturous joy can bring. C.S. Lewis says that when we have a moment of joy, that we experience a homesickness for a home that we never knew we had. We weren't aware of having it or losing it. And so on the other side of that, there is a kind of anxiety, anxiousness, and terror that, oh my gosh, I just experienced this joy. What do I do with it? That was Wordsworth, mingling those two things together. Glick just takes the downside, and it's elegy. It's not the joy of it. And this is a symptom, I think, of a lot of contemporary writing about questions of home or joy or faith or anything like that the movement is downward, and the movement is elegiac. It's lost. And so here's a poem to memorialize the loss, or to recognize the loss. And she even says that as one would be, as is expected of a lyric poet. We expect poets to do that. But maybe we shouldn't. Maybe we should expect them for it to be a bit more fraught, a bit more complicated, as it was for Wordsworth.
What would it look like to remember? So help me understand. What would it mean to remember? What is it with more, just more sort of celebration of the moment while it's present, or is it about being present, or is it about remembering differently?
Well, there's two poems. There's one first by Seamus Heaney, where, do you know the page that's on that poem?
That one I did not write down, but I can try to scan quickly.
Sorry, I should have this marked. Okay, it's on page 111.
Okay.
Okay, so this is it starts with a line, says, I used to lie with an ear to the line. And what he means is lie with his ear to the railroad tracks to hear it. Lines is inevitably calls up the subject of poetry itself. What he's doing now is lying with an ear to the line to hear the poem into being. I used to lie with an ear to the line, for that way, they said, there should come a sound escaping ahead, an iron tune of flange and piston pitched along the ground. But I never heard that. Always instead struck couplings and shuntings 2 miles away, lifted over the woods. The head of a horse swirled back from a gate, a gray turnover of haunch and mane, and I'd look up to the cutting where she'd soon appear. 2 fields back in the house, small ripples shook silently across our drinking water, as they are shaking now across my heart, and vanished into where they seemed to start. So here you have the experience of listening to that train of sort of formative oral experience of the child fused with the experience of the poet, remembering, listening, but listening to the line of the poetry. And so that there's that, you can't see it, those of you who don't have it in front of you, but the next to the last line, as they are shaking now across my heart, is a parenthetical. So we're wrenched into the present tense, but those two experiences are fused together. And this is a moment of great joy, I think, because it links the past and the present.
And so,
but it's also a moment fraught with sadness to start. So it's gone. The minute you remember, it's gone. But it's those two things together.
yeah. Is this related at all to why it is that you say multiple times in the introductory essay, you repeat this statement, the cost of knowledge is loss? Is memory a sort of knowledge, or is knowledge sort of an act of, I suppose knowledge requires sort of acts of memory?
Yeah, that's a good way to connect that statement. I mean, we can go back to the idea of language. The cost of knowledge, being able to name things, is a loss of the thing.
Yeah.
If you take Haas's point that it's falling away from a world of undivided light. I mean, that's built right into the Christian tradition. Of course, the cost of knowledge is lost, where Adam and Eve gain knowledge, but of course they lose a world. And for this in this Heaney poem, that's exactly right. The cost of knowledge of the past, of this moment, and what it means in your life, is some falling away from the unity of that moment and the singularity of that moment. Being able to articulate it gives it to you and reduces it to language.
Yeah. But is there something added in his ability? Is there something that he's able to sort of recover from that loss, or like despite that loss, by shifting it in the present tense? And there's like, this moment is connected to that moment, and now there's something even of the visceral quality of the memory that's like made present. It's almost, I mean, in that sense, it's almost the way that theologians talk about, Eucharist, or right, this real presence of what is represented is actually made present.
It's a metaphysical claim. I think it is. It's a metaphysical claim, and the claim is that this is not a distortion of reality. That in reality, these two are woven together. That time is not this linear thing from one end to the other, but in fact, as I quote Van Gogh in the introduction, that it's round, that it's not flat, it's round. And this is part of my problem with elegizing the past automatically, is that it assumes that we're on this linear frog march, right, from birth to death. Yeah. And in fact, I think that's not at all true. I think times are raveled all together. And I think our experience of life shows us that time is raveled all together. Yeah. I had an amazing experience with Heaney once where I'd never met him. He's one of the most important poets in my life. And just when I was leaving Poetry Magazine, we brought him for a reading, and he had almost stopped giving readings. It was right before he died. And he, at dinner, he happened to be reading a book I wrote called My Bright Abyss, because we had the same editor, and the editor had given him a galley. And I was shocked and I mean, very moved, but he didn't give me any compliments. He just said he was reading it. And but then he leaned over and he said, he was moved. He said that he felt caught between some old form of Christianity in which he'd been raised, and he was from Northern Ireland, so Catholic, and some new kind of form that was trying to emerge, that he could feel trying to emerge, and he'd always felt caught between the two. And Heaney was the sanest, most sort of equanimous guy you'd ever meet. and yet it seemed to me it troubled him. And what I didn't say, but I wrote about it afterwards, was his poems have done that very thing for me. They have linked the very ancient forms of faith with new forms of faith. And this poem is maybe not the best example, but it is an example. But they've fused those two things, in which I too feel myself caught much of the time. And art was the way that Heaney found of doing that, of linking those two things together.
You had another poem that offers a memory. Those winter Sundays on page 178. Would you read that?
This is a good example of a poem of W.H. Auden once described poetry as the clear expression of mixed feelings. And this is a good depiction of that. Robert Hayden was the first African-American poet laureate. They didn't call it that then, they call it poet consultant or something like that. From Detroit, and this poem is set there. Those winter Sundays. Sundays too, my father got up early and put his clothes on in the blue-black cold. Then with cracked hands that ached from labor in the weekday weather, made banked fires blaze. No one ever thanked him. I'd wake and hear the cold splintering, breaking. When the rooms were warm, he'd call, and slowly I would rise and dress, fearing the chronic angers of that house. Speaking indifferently to him who had driven out the cold and polished my good shoes as well. What did I know? What did I know of love's austere and lonely offices? So in this poem, the house is, it's happening on a Sunday, so they're getting ready for church. And this is something the father does all the time. He polishes the shoes and gets the fire going. But you also know that the child fears the chronic angers of that house. And so that there's some friction and potential violence maybe that he identifies with home. And then we get to the end, and he never thanks his father. Nobody does. And then he says, what did I know? What did I know? That wonderful repetition where he reinforces it, of love's austere and lonely offices. Yeah. That word offices is so strange in this poem, which seems to be a kind of blue collar existence. And suddenly you get office, could be the office of a priest, could be the office that you go to work in.
It sounds like monastic offices, right? Liturgical offices, right? From like the life of a monastic community. And so he's figuring his home as a sort of monastic community, and recognizing at this remove now that this was his father keeping the office, keeping the sort of daily rhythm of love in this. That the lonely and austere and lonely offices. Love's austere and lonely offices. That line just is etched in my brain. And
it just suggests that love, like home, is one of those words that can take on forms that you might not recognize if you're first thinking about those words. Love, what could be more sentimental than love? But in this poem, it's austere and lonely. Yeah. And yet there is love in this poem. There's very definitely love, and the poet feels it.
Yeah.
Years later.
The angers notwithstanding, but even bracketing the angers for a moment. I've often remarked to friends that, I don't know, especially, as a Christian pastor in Christian communities, we often sort of think about heroic acts of love. We have this, in a certain sense, heroic act of love right at the center of the faith, and even commended to us what greater love has a person than this, that they lay down their life for their friends. I think, okay, so we spend a certain amount of time, sort of heroically imagining ourselves like laying down our lives for those we love. It's much easier for me to lay my life down for my wife than to like do an extra set of dishes. And I just love the way that like, but love has so much more to do with the lonely, austere offices, it seems, than any of the, certainly the heroic, sort of I don't glamorous sort of offices, as it were. Those are few and far between, and love is built so much more of those, of that regular. I mean, I also often think, again, when I think of like monastic offices, it just strikes me as like, dang, if you're going to pray like 6 times a day, sometimes in the middle of the night, like that is just going to get tedious, right?
Yeah.
But it's commended through these communities across the ages that no, this is what love, and like, love of God looks like. Does love of neighbor look similar?
Yeah.
Perhaps it does.
Our little nameless, unremembered acts of kindness and of love. That's Wordsworth again.
Mm.
Those moments that you don't get a thank you for.
Mm. We have a question from a participant here today, saying, I always loved that poem about the father starting the fire. Can you elaborate on the relationship of home and parenthood? It seems to me that we feel our childhood homes to be our true homes, and then later try to create homes for our children with varying degrees of success for them and for ourselves.
Yeah, it depends on your childhood home, I guess.
Yeah. Some are trying to correct the mistakes of the typical
Yeah,
home.
yeah. That's mostly what my life has been, is trying to do things a bit differently. Um, I do think of that place as home, but the childhood home itself was always quite a fraught place.
Hmm.
But you do become aware with kids, very aware of the home that you're creating or failing to create for them.
Yeah.
And yeah, you become very aware of it. And
Well,
I feel
parenthood has that sort of cyclical time. Parenthood is one of those moments in which time very clearly has this circular, cyclical sort of shape to it,
yeah,
right? These moments sort of, they get stacked on top of each other. Your child's first steps with your first step, with your parents' first step, with their, or whatever it is. Like these moments, sort of the simultaneity, the generations propose a different sort of simultaneity that's like across generations and homes. I mean, physical places. I mean, my grandfather died still living in the home in which he was born. And so you can get these sort of layers of simultaneity, even in the physical structures, to say nothing of the social structures of the home. So it gets to some of what you were suggesting to us before about the home's time, which is not linear.
although I'm envious of that. I mean, I'm envious of that kind of continuity. And I'm aware that my kids are growing up without it. We live in a suburb outside New Haven and far from any family, either my wife's or mine. And they're growing up like a lot of American kids. Essentially, this is what they know of home, but there's no past to it. It's like they don't have a history or a past to it, and that's a big deal. It's not a small thing. That's a big loss.
Yeah. Well, and another of our participants today asks, what about the fact that many live in countries where they have had to flee home? And a number of the authors that you take up are wrestling with exactly these sorts of experiences, either themselves or they are commending to us to think about the experiences of those who have lost home sort of forcibly. I wonder if now would be a good time to read Primo Levi's Shema on just this point.
And I think also of Joseph Brodsky, who was exiled from Russia. He was imprisoned and then exiled from Russia. And he lived here for a long time. He himself was poet laureate. But he said that the only home is language for him. He didn't think of home as going back to Russia or something, even though he'd had a deep past there. But for him, the only home was in language.
Hmm. Hmm.
Let's see. What page is that?
The Shema is on 56.
Okay, the Shema is a Jewish prayer said daily. And this poem is kind of a takes off from that. It's kind of an ironic look at the Shema. This was in the front of his Auschwitz memoir. It appears in the front of it, this poem. You who live secure in your warm houses, who return at evening to find hot food and friendly faces, consider whether this is a man who labors in the mud, who knows no peace, who fights for a crust of bread, who dies at a yes or a no. Consider whether this is a woman without hair or name, with no more strength to remember, eyes empty and womb cold as a frog in winter. Consider that this has been. I commend these words to you. Engrave them on your hearts when you are in your house, when you walk on your way, when you go to bed, when you rise. Repeat them to your children, or may your house crumble, disease render you powerless, your offspring avert their faces from you.
If I can, I'd love to just read some of Deuteronomy, because he's taking up. It really is a sort of really productive sort of parody. We get the Shema, the statement, the Lord God is one. It goes right into the double love command. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength. These commandments that I give you today are to be on your hearts. Impress them on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home and when you walk along the road, when you lie down and when you get up. Tie them as symbols on your hands and bind them on your foreheads. Write them on the doorframes of your houses and on your gates. Which is, I take it, this is some of the language that Levi's taking up in the, and it's, when you go to bed, when you rise. If I'm following him right, the proposal is think not necessarily on the commands, but think on the suffering, on these suffering people.
Yeah.
Is the proposal? And I wonder if the proposal is that love of God, or surely at least love of neighbor, might come more naturally, as naturally. I don't know. Might take an important and particular sort of shape if it was formed by the regular remembrance of the suffering of the other. Again, I don't know. I don't want to force a comparative on it, but perhaps even more so, or in the right sort of way, compared to just remembering just the command. Am I right to see this? He's proposing some sort of comparison here, right, with the sort of remembering of the suffering of the other and the command to love the neighbor.
Mm-hmm. That's a great observation. Yeah, I hadn't thought of those together at all, but they obviously are. But they obviously go together. But that's a great observation, and I think quite true that it would be more conducive to love of the neighbor if we remembered the suffering of others. I mean, the question this poem raises is, to what extent? Like, do you go through life whipping yourself for what you see on the news? Or how do you remember? How are you meant to remember? I don't have an answer to that, but I think the answer is not an easy one.
Yeah.
I do think that Primo Levi is telling us that, oh, you find this uncomfortable? Well, tough. That you nonetheless, this has to be remembered by all of you who live in secure houses.
And if not, again, he takes up the language of Deuteronomy. There's Deuteronomy; those commands come with blessings and with curses, and he ends this with repeat them, or may your house crumble. Right? he's all to say he's putting a fine point on it,
Yeah.
to say the least.
Yeah. Disease render you powerless, and your offspring avert their faces from you. Either do this, or yeah, you're cursed.
You're cursed. I mean, but that question, I think it's a really, I mean, it's a question I've seen students, I've seen adults, I sort of crushed though under the weight of, like, when will I have felt enough guilt, or when will I considered enough the suffering of others? I mean, it made me think of Ilya Kaminsky's In a Time of Peace, which you have later in the volume on pages 143 and 144, just at the end. I mean, and he's talking about, well, the broader context of the work from which this poem comes. Well, actually, do you want to lay out a little, just to provide people some background for the context for Deaf Republic? This comes from Deaf Republic, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So Ilya is himself deaf, and he wrote a book called Deaf Republic, in which all of the citizens of some country that he doesn't name, but he happens to be from the Ukraine, are going deaf. Like it's like a disease that or like a contagion, really. And but it's a metaphor, obviously, and this poem occurs in it. I believe it's the last poem. Yeah, it is the last.
It's the
poem.
end. Yeah.
Yeah. And it comes after the murder of an African American. I don't remember which one this is. I don't know which one this is, but ours is a country in which a boy shot by police lies on the pavement for hours. We see in his open mouth the nakedness of a whole nation. We watch others watch. The body of a boy lies on the pavement exactly like the body of a boy. It is a peaceful country, and it clips our citizens' bodies effortlessly, the way the president's wife trims her toenails. All of us still have to do the hard work of dentist appointments, of remembering to make a summer salad, basil to make salt. This is a time of peace. I do not of the suburbs. How bright is the sky as the avenue spins on its axis? How bright is the sky? He has the first poem in this book has a parenthetical like "forgive me," but it says "forgive us." And at the end of this book, in which we've gone through the adventures of these people and in this mythical country, what Ilya changes that to is "forgive me." So the guilt is quite personal. Forgive me for doing this, even though he's remembering, he's drawing attention to the body of this boy and saying, look at our lives in this peaceful country where this can happen, and the body just lies there, and we go about our lives with dentist appointments and making a summer salad and feeling the joy of our lives. We need to be forgiven for it. Do we need to be forgiven for it?
Well, that was my question to you. What do we need to be forgiven of, and do we need to be forgiven?
Well, I think in this poem, I think what Ilya is asking forgiveness for is the moments of forgetfulness, the moments when we go through life without remembering the suffering of others. So not specifically maybe this moment. There is no answer to that. I have no answer. You have to remember the suffering of others, and yet to foreclose on joy in your life, not to let yourself have any joy in your life, is to disobey another command, which is to be joyful, praise the Lord, and to celebrate life. And I think you don't have one without the other, just as you don't have these moments of memory without both joy and sorrow woven together. Yeah. I think they're both there, and there's just no easy solution.
Yeah, but it might help at least to distinguish. One doesn't seek forgiveness for the delectableness of the summer salad, or for the
Right.
brightness of the sky. One seeks forgiveness for one's forgetfulness in those moments of the other, if in fact that forgetfulness, uh, if we've slidden into that forgetfulness.
Yeah, that's a good distinction. But yeah, I don't know how you live that other than putting your life to action, direct action in some way, and
Yeah.
doing what you can. But I don't know how you. I mean, it's one thing to articulate it like this, but then, like you, I have students who are completely overwhelmed with a sense of guilt, um, for which they may bear no direct responsibility other than as consumers, which I guess counts.
But that's a reduction of the self, right? To think that like we only incur or can deal with guilt in our in our performance of the office of the consumer, right? Of playing the role, and then we're reduced to all we are our purchases. Anyway, sorry, that it's just that that is not a solution either, though it's probably it's part of it maybe. It's certainly there are plenty of moments where we are invited to be consumers and to not be forgetful in those moments, I suppose, requires a sort of being a conscious consumer, as they say.
One of the functions of art is to bring exactly this kind of moral complexity
Yeah.
to bear. And so what Ilya's poem and the Shema, Levi's poem, both do is suddenly you're confronted with something that you might not have realized was a confrontation. And I think it's for all of us who go through our day obliviously, as most of us do, most of the time.
One more poem that seems, I think you already mentioned, If China, Stanislav, I am going to mispronounce the last name, Baranzek.
Baranzek, what page is that?
Page 70.
Yeah, so Baranzek was Polish. He was and also had to leave Poland and spent much of his adult life in the United States. If China, if China, then only the kind you wouldn't miss under the mover's shoes or the treads of a tank. If a chair, then one that's not too comfortable, or you'll regret getting up and leaving. Suitcase. If books, then those you know by heart. If plans, then the ones you can give up when it comes time for the next move to another street, another continent or epoch or world. Who told you you could settle in? Who told you this or that would last forever? Didn't anyone tell you you'll never in the world feel at home here?
This poem, I think, especially gets to a couple of sort of line of questions that a couple of our participants have had that might be summarized this way: Does a home have to be permanent in order to be a home? Which I feel like is a sort of, I mean, that question at the end, right? Who told you could settle in? Who told you that this or that would last forever? But if it wouldn't last forever, is that equivalent to never feeling at home here? Does that make sense? I'm sort of just wondering if there's a sort of assumption behind this. I don't mean to short circuit the profound loss, right? That's being talked about here, right? And maybe it is there in our ideals of home, at least, that home is that place that, like my grandfather, right? You're born and you die and you like live with relationship to this place. And that is not ours to decide. None of us can guarantee that, and it is explicitly denied to many. Is permanence even, should permanence be part of our ideal of what we hope for a home, hope for one another? I fear that we have lost
Well, I don't even
Chris.
believe in permanence in any form. I think, am I back?
You're back. You're back.
Okay. I don't know what happened. I don't, um, I don't believe in permanence.
Hmm.
Everything is the end of this is a metaphysical statement. Didn't anyone tell you you'll never in the world
Yeah.
feel at home here? So, I mean, he's in exile and he's talking about people fleeing, but these last lines, it doesn't matter. You'll never in the world. As long as you're in the world, then he's saying you won't feel at home. Now, in one sense, I think that's true. In a spiritual sense, I think God is our home, and we don't get a full feeling of God until we die.
Hmm.
And so I think that there is some element of displacement that's inevitable. In another sense, though, can you feel a sense of home that's not permanent, which is not God's home, but a home that humans make, lit by God, hopefully. But in that sense, I don't think it matters that it's not permanent. I think there are ways of inhabiting the earth in such a way that it becomes a home, even if you know you're going to lose it. Maybe especially because you know you're going to lose it.
Yeah. Our time is drawing short, and I want to make sure that we get to what I take it is in some ways the sort of centerpiece of this collection, which is Wendell Berry's poem from Sabbath Poems. It begins on page 47. I won't ask you to read. It's a long piece, but it seems that for all the sort of questions that you invite these various poets to ask about home, about the goodness of home, about the permanence of home, about the possibility of home for all, about the safety of home. Anyway, we could keep multiplying the questions. There's something about what Berry's offering that, I don't know, it sort of stands, to my mind, it sort of stands within the collection as this sort of like titanic affirmation of home by a man whose life, as you note, is a titanic, if not unambiguous, sort of affirmation of home. Like he's built his life in a particular place, and he's really made his life about a place that he calls home. What do you want to affirm about Wendell Berry's concept of home, or the ways that he invites us to think about home?
Well, that very thing, it is very countercultural. And it's a notion of I'm getting a sign saying my internet's unstable. Is it working? But it's a notion that you can, in fact, make a home on this earth. And that if you apply your will and imagination to it in equal measure, then that notion of home can come to fruition. And he's done it. It wouldn't make any difference if he just articulated intellectually. He's got a whole life behind him where it gives authority to the words. This poem ends, there is a day when the road neither comes nor goes, and the way is not a way, but a place. Which I think is beautiful. The way is not a way, but a place. But it's only, there is a day. So there's one, it's not like you get it forever. You talk about the lack of permanence. There is a day when that happens, but then there's another day. And presumably there have been all kinds of days beforehand. And so it's not some permanent notion of home that he's asserting or even trying to live. It is that notion of a human home made of will and imagination. I would say, though, that for Berry, that this poem articulates utterly the cost of knowledge is loss, because for all of his celebrations of home and for all that he's done in his life, part of what he has also inhabited is the fact that his ancestors were predators, and that they plundered the place, and that they were part of the reason for the environmental destruction, part of the reason for the racial disparities. And there's a prose piece that on the facing page by Wendell Berry, in this awakening, there's been a good deal of pain. And when I lived in other places, I looked on their evils with the curious eye of a traveler. I was not responsible for them. It cost me nothing to be a critic, for I had not been there long, and I did not feel that I would stay. But here, now that I am both native and citizen, there is no immunity to what is wrong. It is impossible to escape the sense that I am involved in history. And so in his prose book, The Two-Legged House, I think it's called, he talks at length about the very process of coming to inhabit this place has also been a process of indicting himself and indicting his family. And so it's not one of the reasons I hold that up for celebration is that it's complex.
Yeah. Yeah.
That Wendell notion of home is not some simple retreat. It's very complex.
Right. And it in some ways is sort of antidote to the sort of celebrated placelessness that I say celebrated because there's a sort of, oh, you have achieved the life of the globalist, or you are a citizen of the world, and a sort of celebrated homelessness, which I think is in certain ways a sort of like ideal of whiteness, a sort of like transcendence of like body and space and time. And you can see for Barry to recover that sense of home requires coming to terms, of course, with place, but if with place, then also with history, and having to tell the truth about whatever place you're in, what place is this, and what was the role. What was my role? What sorts of histories and stories led to me being in this place, and the configuration of relationships of people and places and animals and plants and things that constitute this home. And that truth telling really does feel like a sort of antidote to so much of what we sort of thin ideas. Actually, like I said, a sort of commendation of homelessness that I think we can sometimes fall into. Yeah. Well, Chris, we are at our time. I'm so grateful for you. Thank you for this collection. Just make sure we commend this. I'm sure Katie will have links to this collection in the email she sends to follow up. If you're watching now live, watching later, go pick up this collection. Live with it. Just keep it on your bedside table or keep it somewhere. Right? These are, I think, poetry takes living with. And I think these, thank you, Chris, because these have been poems that have been well worth living with over these few months. So thank you for this collection and for the conversation today.
Thanks for having me, Matt. Thank you all for coming.
All right, be well. If you are with us today, I want to recommend as well, keep your eye out. We'll have future conversations, one of which at least will be about one of those books that Chris mentioned that Miroslav Volf and I have been up to writing, thinking about home. I have a conversation with Katie Grosh about that coming up. We have other exciting faith programming coming up. We're about to launch our Life Worth Living class for this fall, other events as well. So good to see you today. Look forward to seeing you again shortly in the future. Be well.